Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Academy of Marketing Science webinar series. Today, we are pleased to discuss field studies in marketing. I'm Patricia Rossi, the AMS Vice President for Engagement, and with Amanda Amin, our Director for Online Seminars, we'll host a great team of speakers. Amanda will be our moderator today. So, without further ado, I'll let her introduce our topic and our speakers.
First of all, we'd like to thank our guest speakers for sharing their knowledge on field studies in marketing. We plan a 1-hour webinar in which each speaker will have around 10 minutes to present their perspective and experiences, and we devote the rest of the time to an open discussion on the topic among speakers and the audience. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Barry Babin, Courtney Sox, and Carolina Verli, experienced scholars with an impressive record of publications. Thank you so much for being with us today. To our audience, please feel free to send us all your questions and comments. We will leave all the questions to after the presentation of the speakers. But feel free to use the chat or join the discussion. Please raise your hand. I will try to keep track of the order of the questions. We will record this event and make the recording available on the AMS website and our YouTube channel. Barry, please take the floor.
Well, hi, thank you, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be a part of this webinar and to shed some light on some trends that are going forward in the research. And so I'm going to just take a few minutes to introduce the topic with some basic information about field studies and really how there's always a trade-off in research. And this trade-off between lab experiments and field experiences, you can think of really as one between rigor and relevance. And, as we hear, you have a picture of people doing taste experiments, and in this case in the lab. And so how relevant is the result you would find for a taste test in a lab setting like this to someone that's actually doing a taste test in an environment that's filled with smells and other people and all nature of things. And so it's certainly always a trade-off. And in my comments from my slides, actually, I'll be honest with you, for the most part, they're taken from my marketing research textbook. And on Saturday, Jack Sheff did a talk to doctoral students that are to be at the AMS Doctoral Consortium, and he emphasized the way you learn things well is to teach those things. And whenever I teach marketing research or my marketing research textbook, I realize there's a lot of things in the marketing research textbook that you will see violated in academic research. There's basic things that we teach that are often violated in academic research. So field experiments are just experiments that are conducted in the field and not in a more natural setting. One of the things, particularly for those of you at a US school, that you have to deal with too is IRB approval, Institutional Research Board approval, or sometimes in the past called human subjects approval. And probably if you've ever been through that process, you've been frustrated by it. Well, you can imagine how much more frustrating it gets when you can't tell the IRB that you can control the environment. For example, if you're having people taste anything, if you're doing a lab experiment, they'll have some way where you have to make sure that they don't have allergies to whatever it is they're tasting. And so you have to give them a long checklist of allergies. In a field setting, you probably can't do that. There's no way you can get a hold of all the people who might be there in the field ahead of time to be able to do that. So there are complications added to field research. And put in terms of a simple illustration, I mean, think if you were trying to do an experiment that involved the effect on shoppers of color and lighting, the combination of color, the colors in the displays and merchandising, the basic colors, blue or orange, and the lighting, whether it's soft or bright. Conducting an experiment like that in an artificial setting is not that difficult. If you need to create a video or photographs, easy to do. If you're going to implement it in the field, it becomes more challenging. So for example, you may get some cooperation from a retailer to be able to do this, but you're not going to get complete cooperation. For example, you can't control what the light's doing outside. And if there's a skylight somewhere in the ceiling, which is often the case, if it's sunny, all of a sudden the lights and the colors look different than if it's not sunny. So you lose control, but you gain a more natural setting. So it's a trade-off between internal and external validity that's going on. The academic literature, as most of you are probably well aware, is under attack now for a host of reasons. But in business, we have a reproducibility crisis. We also have a relevance crisis because a lot of the research that we produce is irrelevant. So therefore, this trend towards more field settings where you can get some actual behavioral results is one that's strong and in response to the idea of returning relevance to our research. So think about basic issues in implementing an experiment. You're going to manipulate the independent variables. You're going to select and measure dependent variables. You have to select and assign people to experimental subject groups. You have to have control over extraneous variables. And the basic question I would ask if I was teaching this, which of these do you lose or most lose control of in a field experiment as opposed to a lab experiment? So you don't have to answer, but certainly 3 and 4, you lose. The assignment of subjects, you lose complete control over that. You lose control over extraneous variables. You can't, if you're doing research in an actual store, you can try to control the flow of other customers, but you really can't do that completely. Or you might think, well, I'll do this experiment when it's not a very busy time. So then you choose a time when there are no other customers, and all of a sudden you kind of lose the realness of the experiment from that case. So there are lots and lots of issues that you need to consider and try to control for. And hopefully try to avoid this confound. So if you've ever submitted an experiment to a journal, this is the word that you don't want the reviewers to say, right? So once the reviewers say you've got a confound, then you probably are going to get the paper rejected. And in this case, once you move from a lab to a field experiment, the chance for confounds goes up exponentially. So trying to identify all the extraneous variables that could come into play is also very difficult, but something you need to spend some time with ahead of time. And so yes, so it ends up being a trade-off between internal validity. In a lab experiment, you have complete control, or almost never complete, but very high control over extraneous factors, so that you can attribute the effect on a dependent variable to the experimental variable in a true way. And on the other hand, external validity has to do with the fact that whatever you would find, it would hold in a natural setting. And in marketing research textbooks, we teach test marketing. It's something that probably is not really what you would find in an academic literature. But if you're going to introduce a new product or have a big brand change, that you'd actually reproduce that in a real and natural setting in the stores and see how people and shoppers respond to those things. And so I think the trend towards more field experiments is recognizing that relevance is just as important as rigor. And we're also recognizing other things too, as the research trends evolve, that there are things that are more important than statistical significance, believe it or not. It's true. External validity is a priority. Another one is that main effects are more actionable than interactions. For a long time, I think the moderation has become in vogue and boundary conditions. But if you think about it, if you find an actionable main effect, that's managerially applicable more than if you find some significant six-way interaction. And also the idea of prediction intervals, which probably I'm not criticizing you because it's us that teach this. Probably most of you wouldn't know how to compute a prediction interval. You know a confidence interval, but a prediction interval is not the same thing. But a prediction interval allows you to assess the variability of an effect. And being able to produce a prediction interval allows managers to know better what to expect if they implement some action that you're suggesting. So I think that's a basic interaction or introduction to the topic, and I'll look forward to seeing what comments and questions you may have later. Okay, so Amanda, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Barry, for your presentation. So now we will pass to Professor Carolina Verley, who will do her intervention.
Yeah, so hello, everyone. Thanks, Amanda and Patricia, for this invitation. So are you seeing my slides? Yeah, so I'm very happy to share with you some of my experience with field studies in marketing. So I'm glad that I'm talking after Barry, because I think our presentations are super complementary in the sense that I'm going to be presenting several experiments or studies that I've conducted in the field. So, and also highlighting how we did it with my co-authors and what were the main issues that we had, or that to conduct them, or that reviewers have raised in the review process for the papers. So my very first experiment, this experiment was done as a part of the first grant I've answered. I was still a PhD student in France. It was conducted in France, and basically what we wanted to see, the main objective of this paper was to see how we could promote healthy eating among adolescents, and we tested different types of appeals for healthy eating promotion campaigns, social and health arguments, for example, varying regulatory orientation, but I won't go into these specifics. But basically, our problem is that we wanted to test these advertisements with adolescents. So how can we have access to adolescents? Well, we decided we were going to assess them through the schools, middle and high schools. And then we started calling schools in France to see who could receive us, and they said, no, we don't decide anything by ourselves. You have to contact the local government that organizes the whole school setting in our region. And that's how we had to do. And this was back in 2008. So before contacting them, we need to write a formal letter explaining the whole process. And then we had a meeting, and we obtained agreement with the local government that provide us the access to the local schools. And then we needed to negotiate with each school, and we have 5 schools in the main experiment, but we did a pre-test with 3 other schools before. So imagine the negotiation that we went through. Because we were collecting data with kids, we needed to ask parental consent, which was done through a letter. At that time, a formal letter that we had to receive. So that was also one of the points. Basically, we need to have a research assistantship team to help manage data collection, because how we did it, to test our advertisements, we printed brochures with filler ads and the target advertisements inside. We randomly assigned participants in classrooms in a more exam design to our conditions in an individual manner. So each one received an envelope that contained one of the brochures, that they look at that individually, and then answered a questionnaire. And in that questionnaire, we measure our key dependent variables. So basically, to thank them for participating in our experiment, we offered them the choice between a cereal bar and a chocolate bar, because it was a more healthy and less healthy option, and we wanted to see. But we had to cover the cereal bars and chocolate bars, not to leave them to the influence of the brands, which would be a confound that Barry talked about. So we put them in blank envelopes, and they made the choice in the questionnaire. And at the end, we have to switch the questionnaires against the thank you gift. So this was my very first experience with field experiments, and it was complex. There are easier ways to do. So the next one is easier. So this experiment was conducted in 2016 inside the business school where I work. And it was a quasi-experiment. So here we don't have random assignment. We're giving away a lot of elements of rigorous experiments, but the field data was very interesting. So what we wanted to see was we were testing different type of nutritional front of packaging labels, and we wanted to see how they influence food consumption. So we thought, okay, let's put the labels in the vending machines. So we started with a control condition in which there was no label. So we measured sales in the vending machine for 1 week. In the second week, we put a 5-color label that you can see in the screen, because we couldn't put labels in each product at that time. We put them between the price and the number because they had to look at it to make their choices. And then in the third week, we tested a second label, which was with only 3 colors in the same format as the one that you're seeing here. And our key dependent variable was the percentage of healthy products sold during this period. So to obtain this data and to do the study, we had to negotiate with the owners of the vending machine, which are independent from the school. And a curious thing about this experiment is that we really wanted to have products that varied in nutritional quality. And normally at that time in France, you only had unhealthy products in the vending machine. So we had to negotiate with them to include healthier products there, so that we could have like A or B labels also in the setting of our experiment. And we had to delay data collection by 6 months so that we didn't have any novelty effects. Right. So besides because we wanted also to control for covariates, to measure different reactions, etc., we also had a survey with people who bought something in the vending machine during this period. So for some days during the weeks where data collection was going on, week 1, week 2, and week 3, we had a team of research assistants nearby the vending machines asking people to answer paper questionnaires on a voluntary basis. So we had 267 questionnaires, which represented roughly 28% of total sales. An important thing, so this was easier to operationalize, but it was harder to sell because it was a quasi-experiment. So basically, some reviewers were really against this study, while others, and in particular our associate editor for this paper, he said, okay, acknowledge the limitations. This field data is really good, you have to, but acknowledge the limitations. So we have a huge limitation sessions to explain what are all possible confounds that we may have in this study. And we were super happy to be able to maintain it, and we published it in 2022 in Journal of Public Policy and Marketing as a part of a group of studies. So we had like 5 other studies, and this was one of them. So we also had controlled studies in this paper. So another very different setting for a field experiment was a study that we did in a running race in Grenoble. And our objective here was to see how perceptions of exercise would influence food consumption. So this is also a third study in a paper that had more controlled studies in the beginning in the lab. And we wanted to see, okay, does this hold in the field in a real setting? So basically what we wanted to do, and this was not an experiment, this was just a study, a correlational study, because we measured how much fun people had during the race. And believe me, there's variance. There are people who have a lot of fun and others that have less fun while doing a race. And we wanted to see how this would be correlated or not with their snack choices. So they also had a choice here between a cereal bar and a chocolate bar. They didn't see the brands. And to operationalize this study, we negotiated with the race organizers, and that was pretty easy. They said, okay, no problem. You can come to the finish aid station after people had completed the race and interview them on a voluntary basis. So we had one research assistant inviting people to participating, distributing the paper questionnaires. And once they came back with the paper questionnaires, we would ask them what would they like to have as a thank you gift for participating in the study, a cereal bar or a chocolate bar. And this was the key dependent variable in this study. So again, if there are a lot of limitations in the study, but as long as you recognize them and you combine with more rigorous studies, you may have some elements. So another study that I would like to share with you is one that we did in partnership with the University Restaurant here in Grenoble area. So this is a huge restaurant in the university that receives about like 400 people, between 300 and 400 people per lunch. And we wanted to test these images that appear here are ways to communicate food-based dietary guidelines. And they were being changed at that time in France. This was conducted in 2017. And we wanted to see, okay, what happens with food choices if people have trays that have a sheet, as you can see in the picture, that have the food-based dietary guidelines that are more easier to understand versus more complex. So that was the basic argument. We had 3 types of food-based dietary guidelines that were used, and a control one that was unrelated, just to have a control condition. The negotiation with the restaurant administration was easy, but the way to operationalize the study was really hard. So we had to print the tray sheets that we would put and give them to participants. We made random assignment by every 10 minutes, people were in the self-service line. This was a self-service line. So every 10 minutes, they would receive one, and we would break when there was a party of participants so that all the people in the same party had the same condition, right? And we other research assistants would distribute questionnaires to measure different variables, and we would have like 5 research assistants in the kitchen receiving the trays with the leftovers so that we could weight the leftovers to really have food consumption data. We have also weighted everything in the beginning, so we had a baseline measure of the quantities. So this was also a very cool study, but this we didn't publish yet because reviewers didn't like it, and there are problems, internal validity. So I am thinking about running it again with this restaurant to see if we can get there, because sometimes that's also a problem with field studies. It's they're not perfect, as it was explained before. In this partnership with the University Restaurant, we were also able to do another study later on, and this was 2018, I believe. And we did another study on nutritional labels, complementary to the one that I presented on the vending machines. But here we put labels in all products in cafeteria in the university, and we also had 3 weeks of observation. And what we wanted to see here was how the nutritional labels influenced or not food choice in the long run. Here we didn't ask for any questionnaires, we just measured sales data, and we had like 2,357 purchase observations, and that's a study that complements other studies conducted in the lab, right? So it doesn't stand alone as it is. And that's often the case with field studies. You often have to build a set of studies and put them together. And finally, we are now conducting a very a larger study on how to change behavior of people related to who are trying to negotiate their debt. Okay, so this is financial decision making, so it changes from food, but still I'm trying to run a field study. And we are partnering here with Serasa Experian, which is a company that helps people negotiate their debt in Brazil. Well, they do it in several countries, but we are collaborating with the Brazilian company itself. And what we wanted to see is how different motivation factors could make people pay their debts more often through an online application, right? So they have online applications where people can negotiate their debt, and there are different ways that you can present the debt payment, and those are the ones that we are going to be framing in this field study. And I'm presenting this study for two reasons. First, because it's completely different from food studies, which are relatively easier to operationalize, but also because it's a multi-study project, right? For us to really understand debtors' behavior in Brazil, we had to conduct qualitative interviews with people who were negotiating their debt in a debt fair. Those are the pictures of the debt fair that took place in March in Brazil. So we conducted 20 semi-structured interviews. I am an experimental researcher, so I'm not sure I'm going to be publishing any time this qualitative data, but it was really insightful to understand what can motivate consumers to pay their debt and to see if that was fit with the theory. And we are negotiating the field study with their online application. So they're going to be manipulating what appears in the screen for consumers once they are choosing how to pay their debt. And we're going to be running a major experiment with 21,000 people in June this year. How do you do this with a large corporation with over 1,000 employees? Well, we need initial agreement with the CEO, but that's definitely not enough because it's not the CEO that's going to be helping you collect your data. So you really need to have the key executives and the team with you. So we have been doing multiple teams with the key executives to explain the design of the project and create involvement, because you need their involvement for the project to happen. As I told you, the data collection is scheduled to happen in June, and our objective initially was to do a mega study design, as this mega study is with 27 conditions that are published in Nature, etc. But basically, it was impossible to run an experiment, a mega study with multiple incitations in their online application. So we had to split into 3 separate studies. So from a theoretical perspective, we have to change also things. And importantly, the company had to involve and convince one of their B2B partners to run 2 of the studies because they couldn't do it alone. They had to negotiate with the B2B partner that offered the debt negotiation. Okay, so those are a couple of experiments, and I already talked too much. So I will be happy to answer if you have questions.
Thank you, Carolina, for the presentation of these different field studies. Very interesting. So now I'll pass the microphone to Courtney. Courtney, thank you for being here with us.
Oh, I apologize if there's background noise. I just got out of class and my colleague is having a Zoom meeting in the office over, so hopefully you can't pick up too much of that. So what I thought I would do is I kind of just came up with a list of kind of do's and don'ts that I'd learned. And so I thought I'd kind of go through some of those, and maybe after we can have some discussion on anything you think. So one thing that I've learned through doing field studies is that it's really important to try to leverage relationships. I have not had very good luck just walking into businesses and asking them to partner with me for running field studies. The studies that have been successful and the field partners that I repeatedly work with are people that I know and have built a relationship over time. So really kind of do leverage those relationships. The second thing was really to try to keep it simple. I've gone into field studies before, and I've had these ambitious plans of all these things I was going to try to do. And in a lab, it's great. You can be ambitious. You can have, large, complex designs. But what I've learned is that kind of the field studies that have worked out and that have ended up in the papers I published have really just been kind of simple studies where we're trying to demonstrate an effect that we've already shown. To Carolina's point, they're usually one of a package of studies where we're trying to demonstrate that, hey, this effect persists in these noisy conditions. All these other things going on. So really just try to keep it simple. Don't try to do too much. I've learned that it's always good to give the company something, and that when you approach them, if to get their initial buy-in, they don't necessarily care about, where you're going to publish this or what the theoretical implications. They care about their business. And so if you can tell them, well, hey, look, I'm doing this study and here's what insights I can provide for you from that. I'm testing out, last week I finished a study where we tested out some different signage for a local coffee shop. And at the end, I was able to say, okay, so when we use this sign, this is what happened to your sales compared to the other sign or no sign. And so those are the kind of things that the business owners I found are more interested in. Try not to disrupt business. So whatever you plan to do, make sure that you can do it without disrupting the normal pattern of business, because the last thing that a business person is going to want to do is help you if it's to their detriment. So make sure that you're not going to be annoying customers or disrupting the regular operations. I talked a little bit about trying to complement other studies. So for me, really a field study is one part of my empirical package. Typically, it's not going to, show all my boundary conditions and my serial mediation. Those are things that can be done in tightly controlled lab studies or perhaps an MTurk study. So really just try to build a package of studies where a field study is going to complement these other studies by maybe showing one or two things. And then the last two things were really, so be optimistic. So I always try to go into, whether it's just the initial meeting with the field partner or the data collection, I always try to be really optimistic. But at the end of the day, I've had a lot of situations where effects that you find in the lab, you don't necessarily have the easiest time finding in the field, because in the lab, everything's very controlled. So be a little bit optimistic. Don't beat yourself up if it doesn't work. I've spent a lot of time and research money, and sometimes, at the last minute, something will happen and the field partner will say, well, we can't give you the data, or we had to stop the experiment because I had one study where we changed the ambient lighting in multiple stores, and one customer came in and was complaining that she couldn't see, and so the manager on duty was like, well, this is a safety issue. So after all the calibration and all the meetings, one assistant manager just had to cater to a customer, and unfortunately for me, that messed up the study. But you have to kind of work within the parameters that you have. So don't beat yourself up if it goes wrong.
Thank you, Courtney, for your interventions and very good points made. So I think we now will open to the discussion, more freely discussion between the audience and the speakers. So if you have any specific questions, if you want to put your video on, I would just ask you to raise your hand so we have some control over it. If you have questions, you can also put it in the chat if you prefer. But meanwhile, I will enjoy and make one question myself to the speakers. So my question would be, I will have two questions, but let's start with the first one. What is the importance that you see of the field studies for a publication, or more specifically for a top journal publication? Are they really necessary? Or to what extent you see as, for example, because you all served as reviewers to journals, how much do you see the contribution of a field study as someone that is submitting for the first time their papers to a publication, to what extent does it really help a paper to get in, get accepted, or get a review?
Well, I guess I'll answer that first. It depends on the journal that you're submitting to. But journals like JAMS that really emphasize relevance and managerial relevance, it's become near essential to have some kind of behavioral data. And the idea of publishing an article that just uses types of classroom experiments or experiments that are tightly controlled with convenient subjects, it's become very hard to publish those in a managerially relevant journal. Other journals, it may not be the case, but I'd also have you just take a look. If you look at much older literature, the empirical studies from the 1950s and 60s are almost all done in the field. There were very, very few lab experiments. Maybe back then it was easier to get the kind of cooperation from companies. You didn't have an IRB approval to deal with back then. It could have been that it was easier, but I just think that's the way that researchers thought about studying things, because most of them also had real world experience or were still actively engaged in the field. And that also gave them better connections. So I think the short run, I think the demand for field type studies with behavioral outcomes is probably going to increase, not decrease. So if you want to publish, you need to think of ways you can get some real world data into your research.
So now we have a question from Holly. I will let you ask your questions to the speakers. You're muted.
Sorry about that. My question is for Barry. I really appreciated what you were saying about the need for more relevance in the research that we're conducting. I'm wondering if you know of any certain publications, any papers that we can cite that call for, or other sources, maybe not academic papers, but other sources that would be credible that call for the need for more relevance in our academic research.
Where are you thinking about submitting a paper to?
A number of different projects, but I mean, in terms of like your top journals in marketing.
Yeah, being the executive director of the Academy of Marketing Science, I'm most familiar with what goes on in JAMS and AMS review. And of course, I was a longtime editor of JBR. But if you look at the journal you're going to be submitting to and look for editorials that have been written in that journal, you probably will find some. So for JAMS, more recently, Nina Cray and I written an editorial that was in homage to Harold Berkman, but it was talking about how AMS was always meant to be the connection between industry and academics. And maybe we haven't always been perfect in that regard, but I think we've got initiatives like the Building the Bridge grant program that really emphasize practice and research. So you can find calls for that, or in the AMS review, we've written a history of the Academy of Marketing Science and emphasize that that's an important part of what we do. And I think if you look in those editorials, certainly John Hullins got an editorial emphasizing the need for behavioral research outcomes. And so you can find those. Then there's also a stream of publications of people being critical of the business literature in management. There's probably the name that comes to mind is Aganis. So if you look for Aganis's work, really criticizing the way what he calls the publication game, and that the publication game, the tricks that you play to get papers published actually make for an irrelevant literature oftentimes. So I think you can find in editorials some things that you can cite that will help you there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
So now I'll pass the word to Sakshi. So you can ask your question.
Hello, thank you for very insightful talks. So I have two questions actually. So the first question pertains to the consent part of it, and being in North America, as you mentioned, IRB and like the rules that we really need to follow. And so are there conditions under which that consent is like a must, and under conditions under which consent it's okay if we don't do consent? Because a lot of times when you do take consent, you also there is a risk of really diluting or giving out the real purpose of your experiment, and that is going to essentially impact your behavioral outcomes. So how do we really navigate that? At what point we should take consent, or are there under some conditions that it's okay that we don't take consent? And second question is like in some of the projects, like Courtney mentioned, that it is typically a part of a package, that like the entire empirical package, the field studies, but is sometimes reviewers like, okay, like in one of my studies, we are looking at a very secondary emotion kind of thing as a process. And then it's so hard to really capture that in a field setting or on an online field, or even online field data. So how do we really fit that your field study as part of empirical? So is it enough that we just show the main effect or a correlational study and put it as a package? And does that fly with top marketing journals when we submit? So yeah, those are my two questions.
So I guess in terms of, so first the IRB question, I would say talk to your IRB, and that's going to depend on your design and who's doing the study. So if you aren't having any participant interaction, your IRB may say, well, a third party is carrying it out. Maybe, for example, if you're changing the ambient lighting and looking at sales data, then when I put that through IRB, there's no consent because it's not relevant, right? And so IRB will tell me, well, Courtney, you don't have any participant interaction, and so we, this is exempt or whatever they call it. But I think that may depend on your specific study and design, but always check with your university IRB to see if that's something that they require. In terms of your second question was about where does it fit in the package, and I think that probably depends on your research question. So my focus of research is typically very similar to Carolina. I do a lot of stuff on food. I do a lot of stuff on retailing. I'm not really an emotions researcher. So I think that when you think about adding a field study, it has to make sense for your particular research question. If you're trying to show a primarily theoretical contribution and, these sort of latent emotions, it may not make the most sense, right? Whereas if you're really trying to show choice, behavior, or things like that, I think that's where a field study, can really add to the package. Does that help at all?
Yeah,
yes,
and
that is helpful. Thank you.
I think I could add on that the general ethical guidelines in research is if people are maintaining anonymity and they're doing things that they would normally do in public, you're not exposing them to any kind of danger or risk, well, then consent is not something that you really need. If you're going to go and manipulate what kind of drink they're getting somehow, then you run into a whole different type of issue. But the idea of anonymity, that the people that end up being involved in research are they're just going about their behavior normally, and they remain anonymous, then you probably don't need any consent.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your answers.
Now we pass the word to Peter.
Thank you very much. Thanks for this session. I want to pick your brain on a specific issue that I'm dealing with, but I hope it may also have relevance for others. So I'm talking to a local company right now. It is a home builder, and so it's direct sales, and we are exploring doing some interventions in this sales and service process. The company is very eager to test this out, but they have a big concern, which is that buying a home is a very involved and emotional process, and it takes a long time. And there are lots of chat groups here where prospective consumers are discussing all things about this home buying process. So they're very concerned that if they give some customers intervention A and other customers intervention B, then in these Facebook groups, consumers will be comparing, what did you get? What did they do for you? And this is going to ruin the experiment, and it's going to make customers upset if they feel like another customer was given something that they were not given. What are your thoughts on dealing with such an issue? Thanks. That's kind of where we are.
Well, I think it is indeed a hard question, Peter. And I don't think. Well, I think you have risks of contamination for your study, right? So if clients are going to discuss the interventions among them, depending on what is your outcome, this will contaminate your process. So perhaps you can think about a simpler intervention that you can use in one prior stage in the process, to see whether, they call the company to ask for more information, etc. But if it do something, I don't know, like in this case, from what you're describing, right, it doesn't seem to be appropriate, not necessarily for the company, but also not necessarily for your objectives from a research standpoint. Yeah, I don't know what are your other terms.
It does sound like a legitimate concern. That they're expressing in it, and it's good that you bring it out, because I think it's typical of types of things that once you present the idea to the participating partner, they're going to think of things that you didn't think of ahead of time, and one of the barriers, one of the things you have to overcome. So I didn't get a light bulb to come on about how to deal with that. But I think
so some of the things we've been discussing is obviously separated it in time. So for months 1 and 2, intervention A, and then have some time break, and then a little later give intervention B. And we've thought about geographic separation. So in one geography, intervention A, and another geography, intervention B. But all of these were introducing potential confounds. So
yeah, because you could try different languages too, but then you've got a confound to the language.
So, well, thank you anyway for your feedback and thoughts.
Sorry.
Now we pass the word to Rodrigo.
Thank you. So I don't have any experience running field experiments, which is why I have a few questions about the kind of how to practically run one. And I was very interested actually by some of the examples that Carolina mentioned that they run in France and in Brazil. So, and it relates also to the question that Emmanuel had. It seems that they are very kind of large projects, right? And building on what Courtney was saying, that rely a lot on the relationships that the research group have with the different stakeholders. I wanted to know if you can provide more insights on who was funding some of these projects. Was it like through a grant that you did? Because some of them, they had some kind of public health applications, and for example, the debt one as well, like public interest about how people can manage debt, or if it was the organizations themselves that were funding those kind of activities. So that's question number one. And then the second one, if any of you can also share some insights, was about, you mentioned a lot, like you had like all these meetings with the CEO and then the suppliers and all these different stakeholders. Can you provide some more details on the timelines, like from, okay, we had an idea that we want to do, or we want to start with this, to actually you start collecting data, right, with this project? Thanks.
Okay, good. So this is a very important question. And actually, there's not one answer, there are multiple answers. So first, the first one that I presented to you, the middle and high school, we had a funding from a grant that we have obtained here. So I could print the brochures, buy the cereal bars, and more importantly, because that was the costly part, hire the research assistants to help me go into the school. So I had the grant. The grant is a good thing, but it's also, a constraint from us as marketing researchers, because you have to do what is said in the grant. But reviewers may ask you to do something else, right? So it's hard, because it's hard when you have field experiments associated with the grant, because you have to fulfill these two goals that don't necessarily go the same way, depending on what you find really in the field. So the first one had a grant, but you don't always need to have external funding. Think about the running race experiment. This was super inexpensive, super cheap. We just bought the cereal bars, printed the paper questionnaires, and went to the race and called the person. And that, I didn't know the owner of that. I didn't know the managers of, I didn't know anyone in the local administration for the school. So it is good when you know someone, but it's not always a necessary step. Okay, so and so I didn't know people who organized the food, the university restaurant or cafeteria. The restaurant, the cafeteria, the Bain food-based dietary guideline, also we had a grant. So that was why it was possible, because 10 research assistants cost a lot of money. But we also conducted, there are 2 points that I want to answer regarding the question of the negotiation time. It varies. With the schools, took a very long time, right? Because you're interviewing kids, right? So it's like, it's very long. With the university restaurant, super fast, the running race, super fast. We also conducted a study with Amanda in another paper on a bar in Brazil, and that was also relatively fast. But we tried to replicate our study, and we didn't find a partner yet, right? So it depends. But the final study on financial decision-making that we are running in Brazil, that only happened because, and that's the same case that Courtney mentioned, because I have a very good relationship with the CEO of the company. And basically, we've been discussing about behavioral change research for years. And then finally he said, okay, let's do something. And he said to me, let's do something in November. And between November and right now, I think I had like 10 meetings with the top executives of this company there. And, so that's a type of timeline when the team and the direction is highly motivated. So it depends, but I think you shouldn't restrain yourself based on funding or on knowing only.
Thanks, very useful.
So now we have a question in the chat of Emmanuel. Do you want me to still pose your question? I think so, right? So Emmanuel asked is related to what you were talking about. Field study seems to be very expensive and intensive. Does it fit the publication game? I'm thinking not just for a solo researcher, but a group of well-connected researchers with the right funding.
Well, I guess since you mentioned the publication game, I'll comment on that. And I think it can be playing the game. It is maybe a way the game is played right now. And Not everything that you do to play the game is bad, though. In this case, it's an attempt to try to bring relevance into the research, and I think having reviewed articles and quite a few now that are trying to include some kind of field research in, you can sometimes see that they're adding some kind of field study that really doesn't do very much to make the case of the article, that is just, or even stretching to call something a field experiment that's really not that applicable. The term field experiment is not that applicable. And so in those cases, I might get the sense that the authors are just trying to play the game and it's not really contributing to the research.
We have another question from the chat, which is, nowadays marketing is connected with the digital technology. So in the digital context, how we conduct field studies, can you give any real-time ideas of field studies that you connected in the digital context?
I had I think it was like 2021 or 22, I don't know the year, but I have a JAMS paper, and our AE asked us to do a field study, and they referred us to a paper by Gergana Nenkov and Karen Page Winterreich to kind of look to for what to do and how to do it. And so what they asked us to do is basically we were to design different ads. We were looking at how displaying a product packaged as compared to unpackaged influenced consumer responses. And so what we ended up doing, based on kind of the protocol that was published in this prior paper, and it's a JMR paper, it's on product transformation salience. But anywho, so what we did is we created different Instagram ads, and we had a budget, and it wasn't like a huge budget. I think it was a few $100s. And so you can run A/B testing through the Meta platform now, and this is before it was Meta, but where you can basically set a budget and you can then measure the different ad responses. So that was sort of a digital field study that we were able to do. And I've seen other researchers kind of do similar things in papers that I've reviewed, and it seems to be okay in terms of reviewers are okay with it because it is a real field study.
Thank you, Courtney. Patricia?
Okay, so just want to thank you again, all the speakers, and I think my question fits the three of you. I would like to know, how does it work with the briefing of participants? And the reason I'm asking is that we submitted a paper that had a field study in a bar in which participants had to taste either wine A or wine B. And then the reviewers asked us to why we didn't debrief participants and how we would do it again with debriefing. So how does it work? How do you do it, the debriefing after the experiment is done? Do you tell your participants what has been changed?
To me, that sounds like not a very good comment from the reviewers. And debriefing much more appropriate for a lab experiment, I think. And oftentimes in a field experiment, you would have no opportunity to debrief someone. So that's not all reviewer comments are good comments.
Yeah, I agree, and I think I do not, in any of these experiments that I presented to you, unless the participants after finishing the study ask and we had time to debrief, and then you do it, right? But that doesn't happen so often, and we didn't do. In particular, when you're observing behavior, like, why would you, like some of the university students in the cafeteria, in the restaurant, they ask and then we debrief them, but we didn't do that systematically.
Thank you very much. I think we can start finalizing the session, the webinar. So I would like to thank you, the speakers, again, for your time and for sharing your experience and expertise on the topic. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. We hope our discussion was helpful for you. We look forward to seeing you again in the next webinars or in our future conference. We have our annual conference that will happen very soon in New Orleans in May 2023. And we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hope to see you again very soon.